So everyone can hear me, right? I don't need the mic. This is quite a small room. So thank you all for coming. Thank you also to the people joining us virtually on Zoom. So when I first discussed doing this event with people here at JW3, we talked about I was going to be here not long after Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day, so to have some kind of retrospective look at Israel, aged 77 years old, where do things stand? Obviously, it's a particularly dramatic moment in Israel's history, even by the standards of Israel's history. So there's a lot that I could talk about and lots of ways that I could assess where things stand. But what I want to do with the time that we have is talk about three developments over time, or three things of where Israel stands, three aspects of where Israel stands right now, a little bit of historical background. Two of the three are, I think, positive developments, things that we should be, those of us who live in Israel like myself or care about Israel, should be generally happy about. And one that I think is very problematic and something we should be concerned about. The first thing I wanted to look at was Israel's place in the Middle East. That is to say, Israel's place regionally vis-a-vis its neighbors. And you could make a case, despite everything that's going on, that never in its history, never in the 77 years of Israel's existence, has Israel been in such an advantageous position regionally. So a little bit of history. So many of you will know many of the things I'm talking about, some more, some less, but let's just go through this. So the new state of Israel came into the world in 1948, as you all know, in the midst of a war where the expressed intention of its enemies, that is to say that its neighbors, was to strangle the new country at birth, right? So to prevent the new country from coming into being at all. We had the War of Independence. Israel wins the War of Independence. I'm not going to go through in detail all the years and decades of war, but essentially from 1948 until the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel was in an acute state of vulnerability. It was relatively weak militarily. It didn't have necessarily international. It didn't have the international guarantee of the alliance with the United States, which only came in sort of around the time of the Six-Day War, a little bit before. And it was a poor country. It was not a wealthy or well-resourced country, far from. And this feeling of vulnerability was tangible in the run-up to the Six-Day War, when, with an invasion by Egypt and Syria looking very likely, the country went into a state of panic and paranoia. Mass graves were dug throughout the country with an expectation of thousands of Israeli casualties in the war. And at this point, we're talking about a country of about 3 million people. It's a small country with an assumption that the war that is expected could be a catastrophic war. And the decision that Israel makes, that the prime minister at the time, Levi Eshkol, makes to strike preemptively against the Syrians and the Egyptians and knock out their air forces while the planes are still sitting on the tarmac, was basically driven by this feeling of existential threat. And the same goes, I would say, for the push for a nuclear weapons capability, which, according to foreign sources, Israel possesses. Wink, wink. After that victory, astonishing victory, 6 days, conquering of territory, which includes parts of the historic land of Israel, also Sinai, which is a piece of land that's bigger than Israel, right? So Israel more than doubles in size, or the amount of territory it controls more than doubles in size. And Israel enters this period of self-confidence, which many will know leads to hubris and the feeling of invincibility, which takes us directly to the Yom Kippur War of 1973 and the mistakes that lead up to that, which have been revisited an awful lot in the last couple of years because people have seen a repeat of many of those same mistakes in the run-up to October 7th. Yom Kippur War 73, 5 years later, everything changes. Israel's sworn enemy, Egypt, under a very shrewd and pragmatic leader in Anwar Sadat, switches sides in the Cold War. So Egypt, that had been the sort of pillar of Soviet, the main Soviet ally in the Middle East, switches sides to the United States. And part of that shift is the decision to negotiate with Israel's first prime minister from the right, Menachem Begin, and you have the first ever peace agreement between Israel and an Arab state. And this dramatically changes Israel's security situation for the better, because the most powerful enemy of Israel, the country that had been the leader of the fight to destroy Israel, the leader of the campaign to wipe Israel off the map, up to that point, is no longer an enemy. And Israel's southern border, for the very first time, is no longer a front line in the war with the Arabs. Fast forward, early 90s, in the wake of the Oslo Accords, the burgeoning peace process, and there's a general opening up in the Middle East to Israel. So you don't just have the second peace agreement with an Arab state. Israel signed a peace agreement with Jordan in 1994, but you also have quiet back-channel relationships developing between Israel and places like Morocco and Bahrain and other places where there's not open diplomatic relations, but you have these quiet little kind of consulates that they're not called Israeli consulates, but everyone really knows that these things are going on. And the Middle East or at least parts of the Middle East, are opening up to Israel. That all collapses 10 years later, or a little less than 10 years later, when you have the second Intifada starts in the 2000s, 2001, and those relationships collapse. And there's a clear pattern that we see developing where the ability of Arab leaders to open up to Israel is directly tied to the state of Israeli-Palestinian relations, right? So when prospects for peace with the Palestinians look good, then there's a green light for developing those relationships. The Arab leaders feel that the Arab street, their populations, will allow them to develop ties with Israel. And when there's violence between the two sides, when Arabs in the Gulf or Morocco or wherever in the Arab world are seeing on their screens pictures of Israeli tanks in the West Bank or Gaza, that's when these ties become very difficult. And today, actually, I'd say as the culmination of a process that I think began already about 20 years ago, that pattern no longer holds exactly. It's not irrelevant, but it doesn't have quite the same power as it did. So in 2006, you had the Second Lebanon War, right? A fight basically between Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah kidnaps Israeli soldiers, Israel attacks Hezbollah, and you have a fight between Hezbollah and Israel in the north. And for the very first time, you start hearing a slightly different message from the Arab world. So the Gulf states, led by Saudi Arabia, condemn, they're obviously not supporting Israel, right? That wouldn't go down too well. But the first thing they do is condemn Hezbollah. The first thing they do is to say, Hezbollah started this war. Hezbollah invited war on the people of Lebanon, and they blame Hezbollah and Hezbollah's patron Iran. And so you start to see a change in the way the Middle East dynamic is working, where you have a number of Arab states that are basically allied with the West, allied with the United States, who see the principal enemy now as Iran and Iran's proxies in the region. And whatever their feelings towards Israel, don't like it, think it's doing bad things to Palestinians, whatever they think, their fear, legitimate fear of Iran, trumps trumps much of their concerns about Israel. And Israel is recognized not just as no longer the main bad guy, but also the principal enemy of the main bad guy, right? That if Iran is the real problem in the Middle East, then the only country that is both inclined and equipped to take on Iran is Israel. So for many of these Arab states, there's a realpolitik, right? There's the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or at least the enemy of my enemy is no longer my enemy. And that, I think, has driven a lot of what's been happening in the Middle East since then. culminating up to this point, let's say, in the Abraham Accords of 2020. Very much, again, driven by fear of Iran, but also, I think, by a genuine desire on the part of some of these countries, especially the UAE, to present a different Arab face, right? So there are these countries are the UAE is a very specific example. Saudi Arabia is also interested in this same direction, I think, under Mohammed bin Salman, where they want to sort of show the West a different Arab face, one which is modern, which is more tolerant, which is not democratic. That's certainly not the case, but which isn't the old way that Arabs, in the last 50 years present themselves to the West as being somewhat primitive, as being aggressive, not interested in collaboration with other countries and that sort of thing. So that I think has changed significantly. Now, Saudi Arabia, normalization with Saudi Arabia, which is what was being talked about before October 7th, the idea that the follow-up to the Abraham Accords would be Israel signing agreement with Saudi Arabia, that would have been, and could still be, a complete game changer in the Middle East and in Israel's relations with the world, because Saudi Arabia has in many ways replaced Egypt as the most important influential Arab state. It also has a very important role in the Muslim world because it's the home and the guardian of the two holy mosques in Mecca and Medina. So if that were to happen, if you had the Saudis normalizing with Israel, then it opens the door to Israeli relations with the wider Muslim world. So theoretically, you could have countries that have never recognized Israel, have always been very hostile towards Israel, like Pakistan, like Indonesia, other Muslim countries with huge populations and a lot of sway in various geopolitical arenas. Basically joining with getting on the bandwagon and seeing some benefit in signing agreements with Israel or recognizing Israel. Now, this question of if normalization with Saudi Arabia is possible, this does depend on the Palestinian question. What isn't clear is to what extent, right? So prior to October 7th, the Saudis spoke in this very vague way about we need to see some kind of movement towards an understanding that there should be a two-state solution. It was very vague, and the idea was, and there was certainly a lot of talk that Israel would really just need to make appropriate gestures in that direction, and the Saudis would potentially get on board. October 7th changed all that, and the language from the Saudis became increasingly specific and increasingly along the lines that we would have heard, 20, 30 years ago of, unless there's serious negotiations for the Palestinian state, this is not going to happen. Is that a hard and fast position? It's not clear. It's probably the case that the Saudi regime, certainly MBS personally, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, who's the real sort of power these days, personally doesn't care that much about the Palestinian issue. He's much more interested in modernizing Saudi Arabia and keeping Saudi Arabia in good in sort of a good relationship with the United States. But his population that's not necessarily the case with the Saudi population writ large. And there's an intriguing question as to what difference President Trump could make in either direction, right? So Trump is due to go to Saudi Arabia, I think, in a few days. In theory, this is very speculative, but if he were persuaded by MBS, who he has a close relationship with, Trump has, that normalization with Israel were possible, if Israel does X, Y, and Z, then Trump, being Trump, could put pressure on Israel to do X, Y, and Z, which would be could be very problematic for this Israeli government specifically, which is not designed to move in any direction towards any kinds of concessions to Palestinians. So that, I think, is an interesting. There are some interesting possibilities there, and we'll see what comes out of that meeting in Riyadh. But there's another way in which Israel's regional position is dramatically improved, and it's directly related to the war that's been fought for the past year and a half, more than a year and a half. For the majority of the war, the focus has been on Gaza for understandable reasons. But you'll recall that October 7th, we know what happened. October 8th, Hezbollah attacks from the north. 80,000 Israelis have to flee their homes in the north. Israelis feared an all-out attack by Hezbollah, which would have been disastrous. Hezbollah, many times stronger than Hamas in terms of its weapons capability. 150,000 estimation, 150,000 rockets and missiles, including guided missiles that could flatten parts of Tel Aviv. I can tell you, we Israelis received notice from the Home Front Command that we should stock up on water, tinned goods, electricity generators, because Hezbollah could knock out the electricity in the country. So the big fear was, if Hezbollah, instead of doing what they were doing, which was sort of firing enough rockets in the north of Israel to cause a lot of chaos and to create this kind of internal refugee situation where northern Israelis had to flee their homes, but not joining in the way that Hamas had wanted them to. So we know from plans that were the IDF had captured in Gaza, that the Hamas intention and hope was that Hezbollah would join in with a full assault from the north, which could have really crippled Israel. It could have been the most disastrous situation that Israel has ever faced since 48. And Hezbollah did not do that. And instead, Israel took the fight to Hezbollah. We had the famous pager walkie-talkie operation, right? Where this operation that had been planned by the Mossad from several years before was put into practice, and tens of thousands of Hezbollah operatives were put out of action in a couple of days. Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, was assassinated along with several rungs below him, right? So I don't know if Hezbollah ever had an organizational flowchart or something, but if they did, then it would look pretty bad, right? You have Nasrallah, and then several ranks below him were completely wiped out. And Hezbollah, and also some 2/3 of the weaponry of Hezbollah was also destroyed by Israel. So there was a really extraordinarily successful operation against Hezbollah. And you also had the completely unplanned but extremely useful byproduct of what happened in Lebanon, which was the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria. So you didn't just have the end of Hezbollah, not the end, the weakening of Hezbollah, significant weakening of Hezbollah, but you also had Syria being taken out of the picture as part of the Iranian axis, right? So Iran using Syria to funnel weaponry to Hezbollah, suddenly Syria is no longer run by Hezbollah's ally, by Iran's ally, Bashar al-Assad, and there's a new regime. We don't know yet how friendly, not friendly, helpful, not helpful that regime will be. That remains to be seen, but it's certainly no friend of Iran. So that also has massively strengthened Israel's hand. And Iran itself, which has been weakened by what happened in Lebanon and what happened in Syria, was also humiliated in many ways because it fired this huge salvo of missiles at Israel on two separate occasions, one of which was, I think, the most rockets, missiles that have ever been fired by one country at another country in one single assault, right? It was a 300 or so. And not a lot of damage was done thanks to Israel's missile defense and also a coordinated effort by the United States, Britain, France, and Jordan, interestingly, to go back to my point about the Arab states sort of joining in. And when Israel responded, especially on its second time it responded, it destroyed some Iranian production, like places where weapons are produced in Iran. It was kind of a token. What it didn't do a great deal of damage, but what it did do, and this I think was the important thing, was that it showed that Israel can get through Iran's air defenses very easily. Iran is not equipped to prevent Israeli planes attacking if it wants to, which could also have implications for the nuclear program. We can get into that if you want with questions. But Israel today is in a greatly transformed Middle East, not just from 1948, but I would say even from 2 years ago. And I think in a much better place regionally than it was before. That doesn't mean there aren't dangers, and it doesn't mean Israel will necessarily make the right decisions. There are obviously dangers of the Iranian nuclear program, which I mentioned, and also the problem that I referred to earlier, which is hubris, that Israel gets too confident. There's been some criticism of that already, by the way, in terms of Israel's policy with Syria, regard to Syria. Sorry, that's okay. But as things stand, I think that we can, as Israelis or friends of Israel, supporters of Israel, I think we can feel positively about developments in the wider Middle East with regards to Israel. Okay, now I'm going to turn to the second one, which I said is, so I said there's two positive and one negative. So the negative one. Many of you will have seen on the news that there were these forest fires around Jerusalem last week, as we celebrated Yom Ha'atzmaut, right? So around the time of Yom Ha'atzmaut. And for many Israelis, it was very hard, especially in Jerusalem where we could see the smoke. It was very hard to avoid the symbolism, right? That as we were celebrating or trying to celebrate Israeli independence, there were fires burning, and the literal fires were put out eventually, or contained. But there are these metaphorical fires, if you like, which have been threatening to burn through Israeli institutions and Israeli society and democracy. And they were lit a few years ago, and they waxed and waned over the time. But certainly Israeli politics has, I would say, never looked as threatening to the stability of the country as it does right now. So there's a phrase in Hebrew which is very difficult to translate. Hebrew speakers here don't know it, called mamlachtiyut. Okay, so mamlachtiyut is the noun, mamlachti, something mamlachti. So it's a difficult word to translate. It comes from David Ben-Gurion had this concept when he as Israel's first prime minister, the idea that the sort of governing ethos of the country should not be even though Ben-Gurion was very much a socialist, that it should not be about socialism or capitalism or anything else. It should be something that transcends these political differences or partisan differences, and should be about the national interest, patriotism, embracing the founding values of the state. And that's mamlachtiyut. It's a kind of patriotic statesmanship, something that transcends partisanship. And that has, over the years of Israel, through different governments and different prime ministers, that I think has generally held until now. And I think I would make the claim that Netanyahu, at least this iteration of Netanyahu, because he's been on the scene a long time, is Israel's first explicitly non-mamlakti Israeli prime minister. Now, there's always been ideologues in Israel of different stripes, but they've generally been either sidelined or they've been in the coalition, but have been like a small party that has some influence over some aspect of policy, but doesn't really have a say over the general policy. And for the first time, you have a government in which those very ideological, very extreme voices are among the voices making decisions. And a lot of that is, I think, not actually because Netanyahu himself is personally a particularly extreme or fanatical or ideological person. I don't think he is. But he is someone who has, and different people have different opinions of when this happened, but at some point decided that the most important thing is that he remains prime minister. And that increasingly became the case when he was, once he was indicted and then put on trial on corruption charges. Now, we now have so you have not just the religious extremists of various kinds, you also have within Netanyahu's own party what used to be a very, I would say, a pretty loud but not really influential part of the party, which is now very influential, led by the current justice minister, a gentleman by the name of Yariv Levin, who have a very limited idea of what democracy means, right? So it's about majority rule and not much more than that, right? So you win an election and then you can do what you want, right? Checks and balances are not part of the equation. And Netanyahu in the past had actually been one of those people that spoke in favor of a strong judiciary that would protect Israel. There's a quote here from I think it's 2015, I want to say, where he spoke at the ceremony for the appointment of new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, in which he said, "Every time something arrives on my desk that threatens the independence of Israeli courts, I will block it." Okay? And that, by the way, that's also a recognition that there were things that threatened the independence of Israel, because he knew that. He knew that there were those voices within his own party and elsewhere. But as the corruption charges against him became indictments and then scheduled court hearings, he basically allowed the party to be hijacked by Levin and these sort of post-liberal, if you like, ideologues. And when he won the election, December 2022, he formed a coalition with parties that were explicitly opposed to the mamlakti idea of Israel, right? So it's not a coincidence that the big protests against the government that were going on for 10 months before October 7th, that one of the things you'd always see at those protests were big copies of the Declaration of Independence, Israel's Declaration of Independence. Because the message was that this government was going against the founding values of the state. Now, these efforts took a backseat once the war started, for obvious reasons, but they've very much returned, and Israeli democracy is very fragile. Like the UK, Israel doesn't have a written constitution. Unlike the UK, it doesn't have many of the sort of conventions that Britain has, right? So I'm trying to think of a good example. So when Boris Johnson tried to prorogue Parliament and the Supreme Court ruled that he couldn't do so, it was interesting because it was quite in a way, I think for many Brits, I think it was quite a shocking thing for a British Prime Minister to do something like that, because there was always this sense of British politics that there were certain things that they weren't, as I said, there's no written constitution, it's not like the United States, but there are certain things that just aren't done, right? It's just not done, right? And that concept of things that just aren't done doesn't exist to the same extent in Israeli politics, and we don't have a framework, like a sort of architecture of protections. Now, imagine if Johnson had said, "Well, I don't care what the Supreme Court says." Right? That's the kind of message that you get from this Israeli government, right? It hasn't happened yet. They have not yet openly disobeyed a Supreme Court ruling, but they talk about, certainly voices within the government, not Netanyahu, but within other voices within the government, talk about doing it all the time. And Netanyahu doesn't refute it. He doesn't say, you can't talk like that. He doesn't say, the minister should never have said that. You never hear a word from him about these things. So the thread is there. There was a quote from a Likud minister, I think he's the communications minister, called Shlomo Kari, who said, this sums up what I talked about before. We are elected by the public. We can change whatever we want to. Right? It's this, as I said, it's this idea that you win an election, and then until the next election, anything goes. And that in a nutshell, that is what the protests before October 7th were about, because the reforms of the famous judicial reforms or judicial overhaul that was talked about was explicitly designed to remove the main check against the power of the government, which is the Supreme Court in Israel. Now, in recent weeks, Netanyahu has been talking a lot about an Israeli deep state, which was kind of hinted at before. He talks about it much more because once Trump started talking about it. So because Trump's talked about the American deep state, right? The idea that you have the unelected bureaucrats, right? The people that are not elected, civil servants, judges, other people that are not elected officials that are really running things and are trying to prevent the legitimate representatives of the people from doing what the people want them to do. That Netanyahu has very much seized on that and has now openly talks in that way. He made this long speech about it in the Knesset. And I decided that I wrote something where I said that there's two conflicting narratives now in Israel. You have the supporters of Netanyahu, who, and I'll get to this later, but it's important to note, are not a majority of the country. If there are elections tomorrow, Netanyahu would not win. There's not going to be elections now for a while, so who knows? But Netanyahu does not command the majority of the country in any poll since October 7th or even before. But I think you have the deep state theory, which is Netanyahu's theory, and you have what I call the Louis XIV theory. So people may have heard of this phrase, l'état c'est moi, right? The French King of France, 17th century, l'état c'est moi, the state is me. And this is the message Netanyahu has been giving us for several years, that Netanyahu's political interests are indistinguishable from the interests of the state of Israel. And now to accept that the Louis XV theory, my theory, you have to believe that for several years, and certainly since he was indicted on corruption charges, his priority has been staying in power at all costs, and he's done multiple things that are not in the national interest, in fact, are against the national interest towards that goal. And I could list a whole bunch, and I will if you want me to later. But even when those costs affect the Israeli economy, for example, he delayed the state budget by like 2 years, which was disastrous for the country, just in order that he could avoid having to hand over power to someone else, and also unforgivably security. We don't yet know exactly what happened on October 7th and exactly who is to blame and in what way, but many Israelis are convinced that October 7th would not have happened were it not for the country being in turmoil as a result of the judicial reform. Now, to accept Netanyahu's theory, the deep state theory, you have to believe the following. You have to believe that all of the justices on the Supreme Court, several of them, by the way, that are right-wing by any definition, according to the new definition of right-wing, which means you support Netanyahu. So all the justices of the Supreme Court, the current and previous Israeli attorney generals, both from right-wing backgrounds, actually, the previous one appointed by Netanyahu, the former police chief, also appointed by Netanyahu, much of the leadership of the IDF and the Shin Bet and the Mossad, and politicians from across the spectrum, including many former ministers of the Likud, and the media establishment, are all part of a conspiracy to remove Netanyahu from power. That's the only way, that's basically what he's trying to sell, okay? That all of these different people have over the last 3 or 4 years combined in a deep state plot to remove him from power. And you can draw whatever conclusions you want from that. So this is a very threatening situation in Israel. And I can, when we get to Q&A, I'm happy to answer more questions on it. It's something I've been writing about and talking about for a long time. But I want to leave it there for now. Now, I want to end on the positive. So, yes, it is the first time, I think, in the state's history that you have an Israeli government that has declared war, essentially, on many state institutions in Israel, including the head of the Shin Bet, who he's been trying to fire. But it's also the first time, I think, that support for the state of Israel and the people of Israel is very, very distinct from supporting the government of Israel. I mean, you could always make a case that it's distinct, but I think it's fundamentally distinct at this point. There's this old adage that people get the governments they deserve, especially in democracies. And I would say that nowhere and at no time was that less true than Israel today, at this juncture in history, because I think ordinary Israelis have stepped up absolutely magnificently in the past few years in many, many ways. Firstly, in the aftermath of that election, okay, so it was a legitimate election. It's not like, there's no claim, no one's making the claim that he stole the election. It was a legitimate election. He won the election by the rules of Israel's weird electoral system. He formed a coalition, but it was very, very narrow, right? It wasn't even, if you combine the percentages of people that voted for the party of the coalition, it wasn't even 50%. It's a little below 50%. But through the vagaries of the system, he formed a coalition. Fair enough. But what he did after that was then to embark on this judicial reform, which is not what people voted for. There were a lot of people who voted for the Likud who were very, very upset because Netanyahu had run on security, as always, and on the cost of living. He didn't even mention this judicial reform, and yet the very first thing that was done was this announcement by his new justice minister within 2 weeks of the coalition being formed that they were going to embark on this reform, which would fundamentally change how the state of Israel operates. And so you saw, I don't know if this was a record, but the polls showed a plummeting in support for the government within a month of the government coming into office. And so you had these mass protests that started really like the first Saturday night after this announcement across the country. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis on the street every week in every city. The largest one was in Tel Aviv, but also in Jerusalem, where I live, and other places. There were these demonstrations, and I interviewed for a piece I was writing. I interviewed these Hungarian and Polish academics who are also activists in their own countries against their own sort of authoritarian governments. And they came out on the streets and saw the Israeli protests. And I think the Hungarian guy was in tears. He said that they said that in their countries, this did not happen. You didn't have people flooding onto the streets in support of, in the name of freedom and democracy, holding up the Declaration of Independence, holding up the flag of the country. And I think what was so amazing about the Israeli demonstrations was that these were explicitly patriotic demonstrations. It wasn't like, for example, you see anti-government demonstrations in the United States, let's say, where you might see the American flag being torn up, or criticizing the founding of the United States and bashing the United States as an imperial power or whatever else, or as a racist country. Israel, this was Israelis coming out on the streets and saying, this is our country, and you, the government of Israel, are betraying the founding values of the country. Okay, there's this, the saying, my country, right or wrong, right? So everyone uses it, people often use that phrase, my country, right or wrong, as a kind of, you will support your country no matter what. But it's actually, I forget the name of the person who quoted it, I think it was an American senator from the 19th century, but the actual entire phrase is, my country, right or wrong, when right, to be kept right, when wrong, to be set right. Okay? That my country, right or wrong, is you act to protect the values of your country, the founding values of your country. So these are people on the streets of Israel, hundreds of thousands, not necessarily there because they thought, oh, I'm right and the government's wrong. They did think that. But it was because they thought the country, the state of Israel, the founding values of Israel, set out in the Declaration of Independence, expressed by the founders of the country, those values are being trashed by this government. So that's one way that I think the people of Israel really rose to the occasion. Then, after October 7th, to help the displaced and traumatized residents of Israel, with the government almost completely absent in the days after the government was nowhere in those first couple of days. Netanyahu was probably trying to work out how to evade responsibility. And the same people who'd led the protest movement, the same organizations who'd led that civil society effort to help, who'd led that protest movement, used the resources they developed over that time and the networks and the email lists and the WhatsApp groups and everything else to lead the civil society effort to help the survivors of October 7th and the internal refugees after October 7th. So the government was shell-shocked and completely inept, and ordinary Israelis stepped up, organizing food and childcare and counseling and other services. And the most active organizations were those that had been coordinating the weekly protests. And I can't tell you how many stories there were in those first few months of, restaurants basically just losing business, deliberately losing business for several weeks, where they just used their kitchens to provide food for refugees, or therapists offering their services free of charge to traumatized people from the south of Israel who've been in the kibbutzim. The third way that I think the people of Israel have shown themselves to be extremely impressive is the soldiers, is Israeli soldiers. That after October 7th, the recruitment rate was 120%, meaning not just all the people called up came, but people that weren't called up volunteered, people that had already finished their army service, people living abroad. People came and responded and understood that the need after October 7th was an all-out patriotic Israeli solidarity response to the worst massacre of Jews in the Holocaust. During the judicial protest, the most controversial, probably the most controversial anti-government position was taken by military reservists, especially Air Force pilots and special forces, who basically said that they would no longer do reserve duty if they felt that the government basically, if they felt that the government ordering them into battle was no longer a government that upheld the founding values of the state, right? And they were called traitors and worse by many members of the government. And these so-called traitors have been among the greatest Israeli of the past year and a half. And I would also say another example, and I'll finish with this, the hostages. Because if you listen to the stories of the hostages who come back and see some of the pictures, many of you will have watched in the recent-ish release of hostages after the ceasefire deal in January. Gadi Moses, old guy, standing very upright and proud with this mob of Islamic Jihad barbarians behind him. Female hostages, the three girls who were held captive together, who shared out grains of rice so that they could each get enough food. Emily Demari, some of you remember, who famously had lost some fingers. There's a kind of meme of her, a hand like this. So she actually offered to stay an extra week in captivity so that another hostage who was older could get out before her. And there were many other stories like this. Liri Albag, who would tell stories to other captives. And these were, I think, I'm responding emotionally because in Israel, we saw this every night. Like this was on the news all the time. Right? And we would hear these stories, and we would see these people interviewed. And it was very, it was both extremely hard to hear, but also made you realize just the humanity and the nobility of many of these people. So I think that Israel, as I said, is at a very dramatic historical juncture, and it's completely unknown what direction things will take. We all know that a few days ago, the government announced they're calling up more reservists. So the war is currently being expanded with the current plan to occupy, at least temporarily, parts of Gaza. Will that work? We don't know. I have my doubts. Will things change after Trump comes back from Saudi Arabia and maybe has some different ideas? That's also possible. So there's a lot of unknowns here. But I think that looking at Israel right now, I think there's a lot to be very, very proud of and to admire. There's, as I said, things to be concerned about. But really, generally speaking, the feeling on Yom Ha'atzmaut has been to sort of look back and think, where were we 77 years ago? And how far have we come since then? And in that respect, I do think there's a lot to be feel positively about. There was, I'll finish with this. As you know, you have in Israel this week, this very powerful week in the Israeli calendar, where you have Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, and then a week later, 6 days later, Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, and then Yom Ha'atzmaut the day after. And it's interesting that you have that week in between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron and Yom Ha'atzmaut, because I think in many ways it's to say that there's time has elapsed between the Holocaust and Israel, and we're not there anymore. We're not in the era of the Holocaust anymore. We have an army, we can defend ourselves. And in many ways, one of the traumas of October 7th was that it collapsed that difference. But it made Israelis feel that we're back in the era of defenselessness. The army wasn't there. There was an Israeli author who said, on October 6th, I was an Israeli. On October 7th, I felt like a Jew. And it's a very understandable feeling. But I was reminded at a Yom HaZikaron event that I was at last week by a friend of mine who pointed out to me that as horrific as October 7th was, he said his grandfather, who was in the British Army and was among those who liberated Bergen-Belsen. His grandfather helped to bury 13,000 Jewish corpses in mass graves. And those people had no names. And on Yom HaZikaron, we have a ceremony where we say the names of all the soldiers who died. Say all their names. And we can fight back, and we have fought back. And Israel is, however difficult it sometimes feels and seems, Israel is a break from the past. It is a break in Jewish history. And we should remember that. And as difficult as things often are, and as some of the problems that I've mentioned tonight, I think that's an important thing to hold on to. And especially, as I said, because we have some really extraordinary people in Israel that are making a difference. So I'll finish there. Yeah.
I've listened to everything you said. It's very, very interesting. But you did say something that I felt I wanted to ask you. You said if there was an election now,
yeah,
Netanyahu would go. But
yeah.
you didn't say who might come. Would it be a more right-wing government, or would it be a government of popular?
Right. Okay.
We've just come back from Israel, and we didn't feel, from what we heard, that there was anyone coming through that could.
Okay, it's a great question. So look, as you probably know, in Israel you have this coalition system, so it's never one party, right? As things stand, the parties that currently make up the coalition would fall well short of a majority. So Netanyahu would not be able, assuming the polls are correct, would not be able to reconstitute the coalition he has, and there's no other possible coalition for him, because all the other parties in the opposition, which includes left-wing parties, centrist parties, even one, I would say, explicitly right-wing party, will not form a coalition with him, especially now. So there would have to be someone else that would be given the opportunity. In the current constellation of people, that would be either Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid. But the name that everyone's talking about is Naftali Bennett, who was the prime minister in that short-lived government when there was the break in the Netanyahu government. And Bennett, who currently is not involved in Israeli politics, has already announced, as many anticipated, his intention to return to Israeli politics and to run in the next elections whenever they are. And in every poll that's been taken since that announcement, he wins, which is kind of weird when you think he doesn't even have a name for his party. We don't know who else would be in his party. It's not even clear specifically what his policies would be. But personally, he's very popular because he's seen as, actually the best word for him, and this has been used, is mamlachti. He is seen as embodying exactly that sort of, first and foremost, the national interest. Now, and Bennett comes from the right. I mean, traditionally, he's to the right of Netanyahu, but he certainly didn't govern in that way as prime minister. He's quite a pragmatic figure in lots of ways, and I would imagine that he would look, assuming he could form a government, the polls were right, that he would look to form a government with parties from across the spectrum. He could even theoretically include the Likud, but not with Netanyahu. This would have to be a scenario in which Netanyahu is out of the picture. So I think the most likely scenario is a government that is sort of probably center-right-ish, with some maybe like a party from the left, but kind of center-right. We're not talking about a left-wing party that's going to jump into negotiations with the Palestinians. That's not going to happen. Certainly not in the near term. But a party that will prioritize bringing the country back together, ditching all the pieces of legislation which are in various parts of the process that are looking to undermine democracy in Israel. And that, I think, is the most likely scenario right now. But the elections are not unless the coalition collapses, which is possible but unlikely. There's not elections until November next year, 2026. A lot can happen, and we've all learned never to count out. Yeah. So, yes.
So you talk about Netanyahu and his coalition being worried about this, the institutions, as we call them,
Yeah.
the army, Mossad,
Yeah.
and the police and everything. Is there a threat of a military taking
Like a
over?
coup, military.
Yeah, a coup.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. It's never. There's there have been other times in Israeli history, by the way, where that has been discussed when you had like a weak government and very popular military leaders. But it obviously didn't happen, and I don't think that's likely. What you have seen, and this one of the major stories in this wider story of what I'm talking about has been the letter published by the head of the Shin Bet, who which was the most extraordinary. I mean, we've never seen this. We've never seen a sitting head of Israeli security basically saying that the prime minister has been trying to undermine him and trying to undermine democracy, and was asking him to, there were things like, assuming he's telling the truth, and by the way, if he isn't telling the truth, then he's perjured himself and he could go to prison. So it's quite a risk if he isn't telling the truth. That Netanyahu asked him to, in the event of a constitutional crisis, to pledge his loyalty personally to Netanyahu over the Supreme Court, to use the powers of the Shin Bet to investigate anti-government protesters, to create a security reason for Netanyahu to postpone his trial. I mean, this is really damning stuff. So on that level, you're seeing from someone who is on his way out, right? He's already announced his intention to resign. But there you have a security chief who is openly saying, that there's something rotten at the top.
But are the head of the IDF? Are they thinking the same?
Oh, I don't know what they're thinking. I wouldn't be surprised at all if there was a recent change of the IDF, right? The new chief of staff. I would not be at all surprised if the previous chief of staff who recently was replaced, Herzi Halevi, if we hear something from him soon, which does not reflect well on Netanyahu. I wouldn't be surprised. But for now, he hasn't said anything.
Another question, right? The thing that shocks a lot of people here in the UK is what the religious right have been doing, right, in Samaria,
Okay.
in the West Bank, right? And they're allowed to go out and basically form a vigilante group.
Yeah. So
the question that comes to us is, does the government not worry about this or anything? Right. Or is it actually encouraging it?
So I don't think there's any question that certain people within the government are encouraging it. I don't think Netanyahu is encouraging it, but there are certain people within the government that are almost certainly not unhappy about it, shall we say. The government itself is, I mean, let's say Netanyahu. Look, he is like with many. This falls into the basket of areas in which he feels constrained by his unwillingness to alienate the far right. Okay, so on this, Netanyahu himself. Do I think Netanyahu himself supports these vigilante attacks on Palestinians? No, I don't think he does. But he doesn't care about it enough to risk losing Itamar Ben-Gvir from the coalition. And this, I mean, it's part of the problem. As part of the wider problem that I talked about, that you have for the first time a government where the extremists are not just marginal voices but are running the show. Ben-Gvir's party was a complete pariah.
Yes.
Right? It's the successor of a party that was previously banned from the Knesset, right? When Ben-Gvir's rabbi, Meir Kahane, used to speak in the Knesset, the other members of the Knesset would walk out, led by the Likud prime minister at the time, Yitzhak Shamir. We're in a completely different world. Okay, it's not about Netanyahu will always make it about left and right. He'll say the left of this and this and this. It's not even about left and right. It's about a government that has abandoned like fundamental red lines.
Correct.
That used to be sacrosanct.
Yes.
And I think that's what.
And one of those red lines to me appears to be, I don't care what public opinion in the rest of the world thinks. I'm going to do what's best.
I mean, to some extent, he's not the first Israeli. I think to some extent Israel has had that, right? So there's Ben-Gurion's famous shmoom comment, right? The UN is so like we don't really care what the UN thinks. And look, and I'll also say, so just to be fair, I think Israeli prime ministers, including Netanyahu, have good reason sometimes to be very sneering at some of the hypocrisy and double standards that Israel receives from the rest of the world.
Yes.
But yes, I agree. It's obviously a different level at this point. There's some more questions. Yes.
Just going
Woman in the green jumper.
Do you think there's a possibility that the reservists will refuse to serve after a while because they're being called up once again?
Yeah, it's so right. So something I haven't mentioned is the incredible demands being made on the Israeli population, right? So Ben-Gurion said back at the beginning of the state that one of the fundamentals of Israel's military doctrine must be that Israel can only fight short wars because it's a citizen army, right? So people, the soldiers serving, there's a very small standing army in Israel. The vast majority of the soldiers in these wars are people who are otherwise have businesses or are employed, have families at home. And these people serving 300, 400 days of reserve duty, their businesses are collapsing. They're leaving their wives at home with children. It's had a huge impact on Israeli society, and they're being asked to do more now. They're being asked to do more, and they're being asked to do more by a government that is also trying to legislate the exemption of ultra-Orthodox from army service. Okay, which, if you're looking for a reason, if you're looking for another reason why Netanyahu is doing badly in the polls, that's also one, right? So Netanyahu is running against public opinion on several issues. That one, the fact that most of the country wanted a ceasefire deal, and also the fact that most of the country wanted to see an independent commission of inquiry until October 7th, which Netanyahu also oddly doesn't want. Yeah.
I was going to say the Palestinians obviously want their own land of Palestine.
Yeah.
With all the hatred that this last 18 months has created on both sides, what is the future? How is that going to ever be tackled?
So I do think that one of the areas in which there's quite a disconnect between Israel and much of the world, including, I would say, people that are generally well disposed towards Israel, is on this issue. Because in Israel, you will not get a lot of support for the idea of pushing for a two-state solution right now. And that includes people who theoretically at least see a two-state solution as the end of the conflict. But the idea that should be focused on now, after October 7th, that we should be withdrawing the IDF from the West Bank when we were attacked from Gaza, from which we withdrew, and from southern Lebanon, from which we withdrew, doesn't have many supporters in Israel right now. And so I don't think that is going to happen anytime soon. That doesn't mean that there can't be steps taken by Israel and others to make it more likely in the future. I think there are things that can be done to make it more likely in the future. But the future means quite a long time down the road, and it will require, amongst other things, as well as a change in Israeli government, it will also require very, very serious reform in the Palestinian arena, because it's not just in the West Bank, not in Gaza, by the way, but in the West Bank, Hamas are still very popular. In Gaza, where they've actually experienced Hamas, they're not. But in the West Bank, Hamas is very popular. most Israelis assume that if the IDF were to leave tomorrow, then the West Bank would be taken away. So that's not something that most Israelis are willing to do right now. But there are people who talk about, there's an organization called, I think it's called Magen Abraham, the Shield of Abraham, which is a group of former politicians and security figures and others who are pushing this kind of idea of a ceasefire and bringing Arab states in to help run Gaza and pushing through with, and it's a whole kind of comprehensive thing which includes normalization with the Saudis and also has this longer term goal of a two-state solution, but that's talking about like in 10 years' time.
But what will happen in the meantime?
So in the meantime, so either terrible things happen in the meantime, or in the meantime, things are done which improve the situation, but will not create the Palestinian state, but will make. There are ways that things can be improved which fall short of a. There are ways of improving the situation which fall short of a full peace agreement with the Palestinians, and that I think is what Israel should be looking at, and hopefully will be looking at with a different government. Yeah. Go ahead.
Do you think Israel can depend on its alliance with the US over the next 5 to 50 years?
Oh, yeah.
And this is in light of what you said about, your first strength was around regional strength.
Yeah.
And the importance of those regional relationships.
Yeah.
But surely the most important relationship
Yeah.
Israel historically has been with the US.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And the answer is it's very unknown because American attitudes towards Israel are changing. Certainly, it used to be the case. So if you went back 30 years, then you would say that the Democratic Party was very reliably pro-Israel, and the Republican Party was somewhat pro-Israel, but also had quite a lot of unreconstructed anti-Semites. And today, and then you had a kind of golden period where Israel was genuinely a bipartisan issue. They used to say that like the one thing that you would get 99% of Congress to agree on was support for Israel. Now, the Republican Party, a lot to do with the evangelical Christians, but also a kind of sort of security hawk, sort of old kind of Reagan security hawk part of the Republican Party, is largely pro-Israel, although there are the voices that are more similar to the old Republican, right, which you see with people like Tucker Carlson and people like that. But I think the Republican Party generally is very pro-Israel right now. The Democratic Party is divided now between older Democrats who are and younger ones who definitely are not, who sound much more like sort of the European left on Israel, and that's very problematic for Israel. And in certain ways, there's nothing Israel can do about that. We'll have to see what happens in America. But in other respects, there are things Israel can do, meaning that the more Israel, or let me put it differently, the less Israel reflects the extreme elements of Israeli politics, then the easier it will be to make alliances with some. I mean, for some, nothing's going to work. I mean, there are obviously unreconstructed anti-Zionists who buy into the whole Zionism is colonialism stuff, and those people, I think, you're not going to change their minds. But I think for others, their main issue is they don't like Netanyahu, and so that could change with a different Israeli government. But I mean, you said 5 to 50 years. 50 years, like no. I'm not even sure 5 years because Trump. Who knows with Trump? I mean, Trump. There's a lot of things Trump's done that Israelis really love. I think he could well do a deal with Iran, which many Israelis don't like at all. So that's also very Trump with Trump, and it's anyone's guess. Any more? Yeah, sorry.
It's not really a question; it's a comment.
Of course.
I get the impression that what's happened now in the last, well, not only just since the war, in the last 5 or 10 years, the pioneers are no longer there. They've gone. They've finished. There are no pioneering families full of it. They've all gone. So the tsunami of change there is really very volatile.
Yeah.
It's always been volatile, but when we had Ben Gurion and people that came after him,
Yeah.
there was more certainty in what was going on.
Yeah.
There was more a feeling of less of a feeling of fear than there is now. Even when I was in the IDF, I mean, we felt quite confident in those days in the 70s and 80s. It wasn't. This is a complete. This is not Israel anymore. It is Israel, but it's not the Israel that.
It's a different Israel.
This change is very, very.
Yeah, I
daunting.
I think there's lots of changes. Some of them very worrying. The strength of the strength both in numbers and influence of a very ideological religious right, but also to be more positive about it, I do think there is, there was a lot of sneering by some in Israel and outside Israel of the kind of Tel Aviv elite working in high tech and sipping their cappuccinos in cafes and sort of being like basically sort of ruthless cosmopolitans who no longer had much of an interest in Israel or much beyond there. There was this joke of kind of the Republic of Tel Aviv that was this distinct from the wider Israel and the kind of general mix of Zionist idea. And I think both the response to October 7th that I referred to, in which those people went out into the streets, and their response in their hundreds of thousands in going to their units and joining up in the fight against Hamas, proves that it is not the case, that these people should not be dismissed as people that are not interested in Israel anymore and are somehow kind of post-Zionist or not part of the national ethos. That national solidarity does still exist in Israel, and I think that's been proven over the past 2 or 3 years. It's been one of the most encouraging things. But you're obviously right that there are changes, that it's not the same Israel, that there are changes and there are things to be concerned about. But as I said, I think there are signs of encouragement.
Well, how can it be the same Israel? I mean,
Well,
it's evolved.
sure, of course. And by the way, it's also much better. It's much wealthier. It's much more comfortable. There's many more resources. It's a first world country, which it wasn't, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So
It hasn't done any good. In
Yeah.
some ways, it hasn't particularly.
Well, for Israelis, but in terms of like sort of general kind of quality of life, it's obviously made a difference. Any more questions? Okay. All right. So, yeah, madam, I guess this will be the last one.
Well, me,
Yeah.
where do you see this going? I mean,
How long this was the last question?
No, I mean, okay, we've discussed what's going on in the government there now, and Netanyahu wanting to stay on and everything, but this government that's in now is not going to go unless they're forced to go.
Well, okay, so all right, so I'll respond to that one because one of the real concerns that people have is that between now and when the election is held, is this government will try and do things to make it more difficult for them to lose the election, right? So we've seen this in other countries, but we've seen in places like Hungary and Turkey, where democratically elected leaders have introduced legislation which has actually essentially made the elections no longer, I mean, maybe free but not fair, should we say? Sort of, put a thumb on the scales in the elections. The country has to be alive to that, and one thing that is very good is that there is still an extremely free and critical media in Israel that is constantly monitoring these kinds of things. And, no one in Israel is unaware. Some people want to ignore it, obviously, but no one in Israel is unaware of the direction the government is going, I think. And my hope is that they will not be able to do that, at least not to an extent that will prevent the public from having their say in the elections. And look, there's also a small chance that the government will fall before then, possibly on the issue of the Haredi enlistment, of the ultra-Orthodox enlistment. That's the most, if anything is going to collapse it could be that. Because there you have a very unpopular position being pushed by the government, which even his own base is against. And it's the one area, it's the one issue in which his members of his own party within the Knesset are opposed to. So there are Likud members of Knesset that are opposed to this this push to enshrine exemption, Haredi exemption. Okay, I'll finish that. Thank you. Thank you. That is what